about the Pharisees in the New Testament. And the question was, where did they come from? Who were they? And so forth and so on. What was the history of the Pharisees? And when I got that question, I had to admit, I don't know. I've never studied on that much before. And so I thought it'd be good to do a little research. And based upon that, I want to bring just a brief lesson to you tonight about the Pharisees in the New Testament. We talk about them a lot. We name them a lot. When we're studying the life of Jesus, we often talk about the Pharisees. Who were they and where did they come from? Let's spend a few minutes talking about that tonight. Thank you for being here. At the close of this beautiful Lord's Day, we are blessed. And there's a lot of things that contribute to that blessing. We've had beautiful weather. We have good health. We have good brethren. And it's just a pleasure to be able to come together. Nobody's interfering with us. Nobody's saying we can't. There's just all kinds of things to be thankful for. And we're thankful that you're here to be a part of this tonight. For those who may be visiting with us tonight, thanks for coming. And we hope you'll come back every time you have a chance. What do we know about the Pharisees? Well, let's talk just a little bit about their history, and then we'll talk about the strong condemnation that Jesus gave to the Pharisees. I think more than anybody else, Jesus had hard words of condemnation for the Pharisees. So what we know about the Pharisees is that name itself, Pharisee, comes from a Hebrew word meaning separated ones. And so the Pharisees sort of held themselves aloof as a righteous sect of people who actually wouldn't and didn't want to associate with others that they believed were morally inferior to them. Remember, Jesus was often criticized by them because he associated with sinners, and the Pharisees would not. They believed themselves to be a separate, devoted sect of people to God. They were members of a religious party that flourished in Palestine during the latter part of the Second Temple period. Now, this Second Temple period, notice the dates here. It began in 515. We've just recently studied the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Remember when the Jews came back from captivity and they built a temple. Zerubbabel led them in building a temple. And Nehemiah, of course, helped them get motivated to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. So that's when this supposed, or this labeled, or this identified Second Temple period, because that was the Second Temple. Solomon's temple, the first temple, was torn down when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem. When they came back from captivity, Zerubbabel helped them build the Second Temple. And so this Second Temple period began in that time frame, 515, when they came back from captivity. But notice the Sadducees were of the latter part of that period when the Second Temple existed. Remember, Zerubbabel helped them build it in the time of Christ, and really in the time frame just immediately before Jesus was born. King Herod had elaborately refurbished that Second Temple, but that period ended in 70 AD, or this says 70 CE, or Common Era. That temple period ended when the Romans conquered Jerusalem and tore everything down. Okay, so the time period is being identified here, but it's given more specificity when it says they emerged as a distinct group shortly after the Maccabean revolt, about 165 or 160 BC. So about 160 years before Jesus was born is when this religious sect of the Pharisees came to be in existence. Notice it was shortly after the Maccabean revolt. Now, we need maybe just spend a minute talking about the history of the Maccabean revolt. When Alexander the Great died, suddenly, unexpectedly, still a relatively young man. Of course, Alexander the Great and the Greeks had conquered effectively all the known world at that time. They were the great world empire. But Alexander the Great died suddenly and unexpectedly, and his empire was divided up among his four principal generals. And one of those territories that was divided up when Alexander the Great died was a territory that centered around Syria, just to the north of Israel. They had a series of tyrant rulers, and the one who is most famous is Antiochus the Fourth. He's also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the Syrian ruler who desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, offered pig flesh on the altar at the temple in Jerusalem. That's the kind of horrible person that he was. And of course that enraged the Jews, and it led to a rebellion, a revolt against the Syrian domination. And that's known as the Maccabean revolt. And it was led by a man named Judas, son of Mattathias, but he was also known as Judas Maccabeus. And the word Maccabeus means the hammer. They called him Judas the Hammer. And he was able to organize the Jews to rise up in rebellion against this oppressive Syrian ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes. It's interesting that Antiochus Epiphanes, this guy thought, in fact, that word means God manifest. He was Antiochus, God manifest. That's the kind of arrogant person that he was. And he was the one who had desecrated the temple in Jerusalem. And so this Judas Maccabeus led the revolt. It came to be known as the Maccabean Revolt, named after Judas. And he had some brothers who were also instrumental in leading that rebellion. That happened in this time frame. And for a short period, the Jews enjoyed independence. For about 100 years, the Jews enjoyed independence. And then at about 65 BC is when the Romans came and took control. And we know all during the life of Christ, and for some time after that, Israel and the regions round about Jerusalem, Judah, and Judea were under the domination of the Romans. But for about 100 years, from 165 to 65 BC, the Jews were enjoying independence after this Maccabean revolt. And it's during that time frame that the sect of the Pharisees came to prominence. Now, all of that may or may not be interesting history to you, but what we know about them is that they insisted on binding their oral traditions. They believed that for generations, oral rules, traditions had been passed down from generation to generation. And they believed that those rules should be bound, had to be kept. Those rules came to be known as the Talmud. You may hear that word from time to time, the Talmud. The Talmud was the oral traditions of the Pharisees. And they wanted to say those, in fact, they even suggested that they were equal or even potentially superior to the written law that God had given in the time of Moses. That's known as the Torah. And so there's the Talmud and the Torah. The Talmud, the oral traditions passed down from generation to generation. The Torah, the written law given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. And so they had these traditions, human traditions, their own rules. They were insistent upon binding them. They placed a great priority and emphasis on personal piety. And they actually believed that they were capable of keeping the law of God perfectly. Literally without any violations whatsoever. They believed that they could perfectly keep the laws of God. And so that's a little bit of what we know about the history of the Pharisees, where they came from. And so by the time Jesus appeared on the scene, the Pharisees had been a leading political and religious party among the Jews for about 150 years when Jesus came and was born here on the earth. Now, with that history in mind, let me take you to Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus makes a statement about the Pharisees. Jesus said, "For I say to you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." Your righteousness, he says, must exceed the righteousness. It must be greater than the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, or you will not, you will in no way, you will in no case enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, let me ask you, what do you conclude from that statement? Unless your righteousness is greater than the righteousness of the Pharisees, you will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. What does that tell you? Let's see if we could draw up a parallel statement. So you're on your job tomorrow, and your boss comes by, and he says, if you don't do better than old Jones has been doing, you're going to get fired too. What would you take from that statement? Well, I'm going to have to straighten up and do better. He's obviously not happy with me, or I need to get working. I need to get. But it would also tell me that Jones has already been fired. If he says, you better straighten up, do better, or you'll be fired like Jones was, then that would clearly tell me that Jones has already been fired. What does this statement tell you about the Pharisees? Well, I want to submit to you that the Pharisees were lost. Based upon that statement from Jesus, they were not in a saved relationship with God. They were lost. Now, they believed that they were very righteous individuals. But Jesus said, your righteousness is going to have to seek their righteousness, because they are lost. And if you don't do better than they're doing, you will be lost too. That's basically what Jesus said. Now, the Pharisees viewed themselves as very righteous individuals. They saw themselves as to be very extremely religious, devout, perfect rule keeping, and all of that. But Jesus said, what they're doing is not right, and they're lost. And if you don't do better than they do, you'll be lost too. That's basically what Jesus said. So, for just a few minutes, let's talk about why the Pharisees were lost. They were a very prominent religious and political sect in the time of Jesus. I think they were Jesus' principal enemies. They certainly received Jesus' strongest condemnations. What was wrong with them anyway? Well, if you'd like to, turn your scripture. I'll try to show these verses on the screen too, but if you want to, turn to Matthew 23. Because in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus engages in a rather long, prolonged statement of condemnation against the scribes and Pharisees, okay? And in that, we can see what was wrong with them. Okay, so what was wrong with the Pharisees? Why were they in a lost condition? Was it because they were legalists? Was it because that they insisted on carefully following the Old Testament law of Moses? Is that what the problem was? Now, that's what most people think. Most people think that the problem with the Pharisees is that they were just gross, overt legalists. And for that reason, people sometimes would call, maybe they would call you or me a legalist. I have been called a legalist. I have been called a Pharisee. And you might get that same accusation when we say we have to have book, chapter, and verse for everything we do. We must follow the Scriptures just as carefully as we possibly can. When we make an appeal for Bible authority, book, chapter, and verse, thus saith the Lord, sometimes those who are not interested in that sort of thing will come back and say, well, you're just being like the Pharisees. You're being a Pharisee when you insist upon Bible authority and you say we have to follow the Word of God carefully. So, was that the problem with the Pharisees? Is that they were insisting that things be done according to the laws of God? Notice that my answer to that is no. Legalism was not the problem of the Pharisees. Now, there's no denying that the Pharisees were very strict about the law of Moses, but this is not what made them wrong. Let's see what Jesus said about this. In Matthew 23, beginning verse 1, then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. So he said, the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. In other words, they are the teachers of the law. And in so much as they are telling you the law of Moses, all therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. So here's the Pharisees, and they're teaching people, you've got to keep the law of Moses. You've got to keep the law of Moses. You've got to do what the law of Moses says. What does Jesus say about that? Do it. They're right. Do what they're telling you. Insofar as they're teaching you the law of Moses, you keep it. You do it. You observe it. Doesn't seem like Jesus had an objection to them pressing matters of the law, does it? He said, do what they say. There's a real important verse. You may want to note this in your text if you don't already have it underlined. Verse 23, I think, is just really key here. We'll talk more about it a little later in the lesson. But at verse 23, Jesus said, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. So, we know about paying tithes, right? We understand that. This is the law of Moses time, right? And under the law of Moses, people were commanded to pay a tithe or a tenth of whatever they gained. When you brought in your harvest, and let's say you brought in 100 bushels of wheat, well, you would be expected to divide out 10 bushels of wheat and give it to the Lord, dedicated to the purposes of God. A tithe, you were expected to give a tenth under the law of Moses. So, what did the Pharisees do? Well, they did that. They paid tithe, but notice he mentions mint, anise, and cumin. He says, you pay tithes of mint, anise, and cumin. What are those three things? Mint, anise, and cumin. Those are what I refer to as garden herbs. These are just the herbs you might... And honestly, when you're growing herbs, maybe a whole year's crop is just a handful. You don't need much herbs, just a little. They just provide a little seasoning to our food. You don't need a lot, and a whole year's harvest might be just a good handful. What did the Pharisees say? When you get that handful of mint, anise, or cumin, you divide that up into 10 parts, and you give a tenth to the Lord. So, what did Jesus say about that? Did he say, you Pharisees are just fanatical legalists? That is ridiculous to expect somebody to pay a tithe of their garden herbs. Forget that. It's unimportant. That's not what Jesus said, right? He says you pay tithes of mint, anise, and cumin, and have omitted weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. We're going to talk about that in a minute. He's saying there's bigger things. There's more difficult things than paying tithes. And you guys haven't been doing it. But notice this last phrase, these ought ye to have done. What? You ought to have done judgment, mercy, faith. These ye ought to have done. But notice the last phrase, and not leave the other undone. So he says the problem is you haven't been attacking the difficult things. And those things he mentioned, judgment, mercy, and faith, are matters of the heart, right? You have been neglecting matters of the heart. You've been very careful to pay your tithes, even of your garden herbs. You need to pay attention to matters of the heart. But I'm not saying you should omit paying tithes of garden herbs. Right? You see that? So people would say, boy, the Pharisees were legalists. They made you tithe of everything, even just a little handful of herbs. You had to pay a tithe. Jesus said, yeah. And when they tell you to do that, you do that. Right? And so the conclusion that we have to reach here, let me back up just a minute. The conclusion we have to reach here is that they were not condemned by Jesus because they insisted on a careful keeping of the law of Moses. They were not condemned for that. You see that? Now, before we pass from that point, I want to take you to Matthew 15 for just a minute. They did have a problem. And part of that problem goes back to what we were mentioning earlier. They were determined to bind their oral traditions, the traditions of men, the so-called Torah. They were determined, Talmud, I'm getting my words backwards, aren't I? They were determined to, their oral traditions were the Talmud. Excuse me, I'll get that right. The oral traditions were the Talmud. The written traditions were written law was the Torah. They were determined that you had to keep the Talmud. You had to keep their oral traditions. They were wrong about that, and Jesus said so. Look here in Matthew 15, beginning verse 1. Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees. And Jesus said to them, Ye hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, This people draweth nigh to me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain they do worship me. Notice, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Their oral traditions were just commandments of men. They had rules like you have to wash your hands before you can eat. That wasn't in the law of Moses. That was part of their oral tradition. But they were determined to bind that on people. They had a host of other things that they insisted people would do. And they were teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Those were not commandments from God. And so to whatever extent they were trying to bind their oral traditions, Jesus did condemn them for that. But in regards to keeping the law of God and keeping it meticulously and carefully, Jesus did not. He never did condemn them for that. And so the popular idea that the problem with the Pharisees was their legalism, that's just not right. That's not what Jesus condemned them for, okay? And so if you're talking to someone and you say, we got to have Bible authority. We got to have Bible authority for everything we do. We got to have book, chapter, and verse. We got to have a thus saith the Lord. Oh, you're just being a Pharisee. No, Jesus never condemned the Pharisees for that. That's not what was wrong with the Pharisees. And if you don't get any other thing to take away from the lesson tonight, I hope that will sink in deeply, because that's not their problem. Now, they had a lot of problems. And real quickly, staying there in Matthew 23, we can talk about some of the problems that they had. Jesus said they say and do not. If we went back to Matthew 23, where we were reading a minute ago, beginning verse 1, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But Jesus goes on to say, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. They bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. They say and do not. You know, there's nothing, I think, quite as despicable or distasteful to us as that. Someone wants to tell you what you ought to be doing, and you know full well that they're not doing it themselves. That's the form of hypocrisy that just really rubs us wrong, doesn't it? When somebody's telling you, you got to do this, and you know that they're not doing that themselves. That just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. But we see that, of course, all the time. This business of a double standard. Isn't that what we're talking about here? Holding people up to an expectation that you don't observe yourself. I mean, we see it in lots of different fields. I think modern day politics is just rife with this sort of thing, where politicians judge others for doing the very thing that they themselves are doing, and it's just so despicable. In religion, it's also very despicable. And so one of the great problems with the Pharisees was they did this. They tell you what to do and they don't do it themselves. That was a problem, and Jesus condemned them for that. We know too that they made a show of their religion. They really wanted to present themselves appearance-wise as very righteous people. Notice there in Matthew 23, beginning verse 5, he says, all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments, and love the uppermost rooms at the feast and the chief seats in the synagogues and greetings in the markets, and to be called Rabbi, Rabbi. Here he mentions their phylacteries and the borders of their garments. Those two things were things that were actually taught in the law of Moses. And so the phylacteries were like a headband that they had, and on the headband might be inscribed a statement from the law of Moses. And so they had these headbands. The phylacteries were taught. If you want to read about that, you might make a note here. Deuteronomy 6, verses 8 and 9 taught them to do that. And then the borders of their garments, they were instructed, if you want to write this down, Numbers 15, verse 38, they were they were instructed to make a fringe around the edges of their garments so that visually when they saw that fringe, they'd be reminded about their relationship with God. So the phylacteries and the borders on their garments were things that were actually taught under the law of Moses. But the Pharisees weren't satisfied with that. He said, you make broad your phylacteries. And so just an average headband wouldn't be sufficient for a Pharisee who really wants to look religious. And so he might make that bigger. Or, and we'll go back to our picture here in a minute, he might even, and they did this, he might even attach a box on the front of his headband, and then he would write out a whole bunch of scriptures, and he would stuff those little pieces of paper in his phylactery, his headband, and you would see him and you say, man, that guy really must be religious. Look how big his headband is. Look how much scripture he's carrying around on his forehead. And then they do the same thing with the borders of their garment. They weren't content with just an average fringe or border on their garment. They wanted to make theirs big for the purposes of looking more righteous. And Jesus condemned them for that, making such a show of their religion. You may remember in the Sermon on the Mount, we won't go to that, but in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus repeatedly said, if you do what you do to be seen of men, when you get seen by men, you have your reward. That's what you were going for. You got what you wanted. But don't expect anything else beyond that. Making a show of their religion was one of the things that Jesus strongly condemned. I think we could also say that the Pharisees were guilty of doing what they did in order to profit themselves. And one of the statements there in Matthew 23 at verse 14 says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer, therefore ye shall receive the greater condemnation. I want you to focus on this phrase right here. You devour widows' houses. Apparently what the Pharisees would commonly do is that they would go to some of the poorest people in society and they would sort of extort money from them. You need to give us this money for the work of God. Widows in particular, in that day and time, the widows were in a really bad position because they didn't have a male winner and they couldn't actually be represented in business type proceedings very well. They didn't have a voice in society. We've talked before about the fact that many times they were regarded as sort of second-class citizens. They were the poorest class, widows who didn't have support. Of course, they didn't have a kind of welfare safety net like we have in our culture. And so they would have been the very poorest people. And these Pharisees would go and abuse them and extort money from them. And Jesus said they were devouring widows' houses and they were enriching themselves in the process. Does that sound familiar at all to anything that we see in our day and time? Well, that sort of sounds like the TV evangelists, doesn't it? Who are just forever asking for money, for people to send money. And you know who sends the money? The very poorest people. It's the very poorest people who contribute to those TV evangelists who have been exposed for living a very extravagant lifestyle. They're doing what the Pharisees did. They are serving for personal gain. Jesus condemned them for that. Another thing Jesus condemned them for is because they violated their oaths. Again, go back to Matthew 23 because this is that long discourse that Jesus gave on the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees. Matthew 23, beginning verse 16. Woe to you, ye blind guides, which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing. But whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he's a debtor. And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it's nothing. But whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon the altar, he is guilty. Now, there's some verses there, obviously, that we omitted. But what Jesus is describing there apparently was a routine of the Pharisees. That they had a code. They had their own particular code. And you couldn't just take their word for something because they had You remember when we were kids and we would hold our hand behind the back and cross our fingers. You young kids probably don't know this. This is something we did. If we had our fingers crossed behind our back when we told you something, if we said we would do something, but we had our fingers crossed, we didn't have to do what we said because we had our fingers crossed. Well, that was childhood foolishness, obviously. But the Pharisees were very much in that vein. You had to know their code before you could know whether or not they would do what they were promising to do. And here Jesus explains that. So if you swore by the temple, that's not, you don't expect them to keep their word if that's all they did was swear by the temple. But if they swore by the gold of the temple, you could be pretty sure they would do what they said. If they swore by the altar, probably not going to keep that promise. But if they swore by the gift that's on the altar, they felt duty bound to do what they promised. That's just foolishness, right? And so Jesus is condemning them because they had this common practice of violating the promises that they made. They violated their oaths. Jesus said they were merciless. I want to take you back to that verse we were looking at earlier, Matthew 23:23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you to have done, not to leave the other undone. So let's talk about what they weren't doing. We talked about them paying tithes, and they were right in that. But they had omitted weightier matters of the law, and he names them: judgment, mercy, and faith. I want you to concentrate on mercy. They were merciless in the way they treated other people. Remember, mercy, we've often suggested this definition. Grace is when we get what we don't deserve. Mercy is when we don't get. Mercy, and also by His grace, but His mercy doesn't give us what we deserve. Mercy is when you don't give somebody what they deserve, especially something bad. You don't lay on something bad to people, that may deserve it. You have no mercy, and you take out vengeance and all of that. Jesus condemned them because they omitted weightier matters of the law, matters of the heart, judgment, mercy, and faith. And so he was saying, you Pharisees are horribly merciless people. And that's a problem that continues to be a problem in the world today, and I think that's obviously something that we want to be on guard against. They were condemned for being merciless, and we might be too if we're not careful. And then finally, Jesus just called them hypocrites over and over and over again. One time I didn't write it down, but one time I went through here and counted how many times the word hypocrite is found in this Matthew chapter 23. But notice the text that Gage read for us earlier, beginning at verse 25. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so ye also outward appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Well, the couple of things that Jesus mentions there, you can pretty graphically see that in your mind's eye. What if someone came and they're going to serve you a dish of food, and the dish or platter that they're carrying it out on appears to be clean, but when they set it down in front of you and you look inside, this thing is nasty, dirty. It's clear that it hasn't been cleaned at all. Jesus said, you Pharisees, you hypocritical Pharisees are like that. You try to make a great show outwardly, but inwardly your hearts are corrupt. And then we've talked before about this whited sepulcher business. Notice Jesus said, ye are like unto whited sepulchres. And we've explained before that when the Jews buried someone in a tomb, they would whitewash the outside of that for a reason. It served as a marker. Don't go in here. There are dead men's bones inside. Because for a Jew, under the law of Moses, if you had contact with a dead body, you became unclean. And you had to go through rites of purification if you had come into contact with a dead man or the remains of a person. And so the Jews, so that you had to bury your dead, right? And of course, anybody who had to be party to the burying of a dead person would then have to obviously go through rites of purification. But when they sealed up the sepulcher, they would whitewash it so that everybody would know, don't go in there unless you have to. Don't go in there unintentionally, because there are dead men's bones inside and you'll become unclean. So that was the purpose for whitewashing the outside of sepulchers. But in the process of doing that, they made them look real nice. They look nice on the outside. This whitewashed tomb looks pretty nice on the outside. But inside, rotting corpses. Jesus said the Pharisees were like that. They looked pretty nice on the outside. But inside they were full of all kinds of hypocrisy and iniquity. They were hypocrites. And so I think the warning for us, the takeaway for us is we need to make sure that our hearts are right. I mean, we got to go through the right outward activities, but just doing the right thing outwardly is not nearly enough. Jesus says if you're just going through the outward motions, but your heart is not right, then you're guilty of hypocrisy, like the Pharisees, right? And so that repeated label that Jesus applies there in Matthew 23, hypocrite. So again, we know some history about the Pharisees, where they came from. We know that Jesus, by the way, I didn't point this out when I came back to this picture. There's that phylactery on the head of a Pharisee. Right? We don't see enough of his garment to pick out the fringe, but that phylactery is there. That's what that box on his forehead is. We know their history, a little bit about their history. We know what they stood for, and we know that they received Jesus' strongest condemnations. I hope that's informative and helpful. Not only that we know about them, but that also we can see some of the things that Jesus condemned about them, with the clear application being we need to avoid those things ourselves, obviously. Thanks for your good attention to what we've had to say, and I hope it's helpful. We're going to sing a song of invitation as we sing.